Hello, cats, kittens, and non-binary folks, both with and without your mittens. We are here on the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I have already. We are here on the Superhero Ethics Podcast to continue our conversation with Mr. Paul Hoppe about Batman Caped Crusader. For those who are jumping in just with this episode, we already discussed a lot of it in part one, which should be either the week before or 2 weeks before this episode. I would definitely recommend checking that one out first. And we're going to kind of just pick it right back up. As we said in that one, you don't have to have watched the show. We're going to try and explain a lot of it as we go. Though certainly I think you'll, if nothing else, it's only a 10-episode show. I think it's really great to watch, and if you can get access to it. But either way, we hope you enjoy the conversation, and we have a little bit of feedback that we'll go into, and want to, yeah. But either way, we hope you enjoy the conversation, and of course, always send in your feedback. So Paul, let's pick back up. We started to talk about the idea of when Batman Caped Crusader is set and how this feels like a little bit of a anachronistic setting in that it is the aesthetics and the technology seem very much of the like detective noir stories, which could be like 20s to 40s or 50s. Probably with the tech being more on the 20s, 30s, 40s side. The cars are old fashioned. All the phones are rotary dial. There's no cell phones. There's no beepers. There's no computers. But, the social mores are much more of like what we think of today. And we talked about why we like that. And I want to extend that conversation a little further to say, for you, does it feel like Batman should be set in a certain time period? Or does Batman work in all times?
Yeah, I wouldn't say should be set in a particular time period, but I do feel works very well in a particular time period.
I lost your audio.
Did you have it
Let me
before?
see if that's on my end or yours. Hold on.
Audio. Yeti. Check. Yeah.
I think it's on my end, so give me another second. I'm hearing the testing audio, but only like half of it for some reason. Let's see if I can figure this out. This is very frustrating. Are you sure there's no problem on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I clicked on. Wait, can you hear me now?
I'm trying leaving and coming back.
You can't hear me now. Yeah.
Oh, why is this doing this to me? Because thumbs up or thumbs down, you can still hear me, right? Okay. Yeah, I keep changing it to different things. It's always the same. It's always just giving me this like half sound for some weird reason. Nope, that doesn't work.
I mean, maybe it could be connection related. I don't know. You're getting some audio, but not all.
All right, let me try leaving and then coming back.
I'll be here. Here I am. I don't know. Are we streaming? Is this like on YouTube? Are people watching this? Anyway. What is a singular more? when people discuss like how someone should or shouldn't.
Let's see if I can reset the settings on the audio. Hold on. Weird.
Yeah, that's very weird. I don't like that.
Okay, so my speakers are working through that, but it's still not letting me hear you. Do I have you muted somehow? All right, try talking again now.
I am talking again now.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, try talking again.
I am talking again. Successfully talking. Whether or not you are successfully hearing is really the. Say, try hearing again.
Okay.
Is this too much?
No, so these headphones are fucked, but I don't think that's going to be a problem. You can hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, now try talking.
Try hearing. Can you hear the way? No, I guess not.
Okay.
I am talking.
I think we have this working.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so let's start with you just trying to answer that question about the time.
I wouldn't say should, but I do think Batman works particularly well in a particular time period. Like, I think modern day Batman's fine. I think futuristic Neo-Gotham Batman is awesome. I think Gotham by Gaslight is a great kind of steampunk 1800s Batman. Yeah. But I do think that the film noir Batman is, if not the best Batman, you know, it's the classic Batman. And there's something that works really well, partially because of just the look and feel, but also in terms of technology. I think a lower technology Batman allows, like, there's this idea of Batman being a little more technologically advanced than the people around him, right? And like the whole utility belt and, you know, where does he get all of these wonderful toys kind of aspect. And I think the further technology advances, kind of the harder it is to pull that off, or kind of the further you have to go with it.
Yeah.
Right. But also just, I think, I think it looks cool. You know, it's film noir, and we don't get a ton of that anymore. That's kind of Batman's origin. That's certainly the animated series look, right? And as far as this series goes, you know, they really wanted to use some of those stories from the animated series without it being a literal continuation. So I think it makes sense that they set it in that same vague time period that isn't a real place in our world.
Yeah. I think you're really right about the technology, because when I was thinking more about this, one thing you and I have said that we liked about both this show and the Matt Reeves movie, The Batman with Robert Pattinson, as well as also the Batman the Animated Series, is the idea of Batman as detective. And a lot of that, I think both are sort of iconography of the detective is very much the gumshoe 1940s kind of thing, which, you know, obviously he's not wearing a trench coat and the like, but it's still a similar idea. But also, like, as it becomes more and more technologically focused, you know, like CSI Batman is not really what I want to watch. One one thing I think is really interesting about Batman is that he does have good tech, and he is often able to, like, lift a fingerprint that no one else could get, or that kind of like technological stuff, or sometimes he's able to, quite literally build technology to learn something about a bullet. I think that's in the Batman movie that, other people can't figure out. But I feel like what makes him such a good detective is his ability to deduce things,
Yes.
to look at fact A and look at fact B, and then read something in the newspaper and put it all together to come up with a connection that no one else would see.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not harder to do that in the technological age. Well, let me say that again. I think that is harder to do in the technological age, because watching people do the research on a computer just isn't always that interesting, but also because I think this is kind of the Zack Snyder direction. The more you make him high tech, the more you get him into high tech fighting technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's just then that kind of leads into the Rock'em Sock'em Robots idea of big superhero shows where it's all about these incredible CGI tech. And I think that's a fun, and I think you can have some of that in the movies. But I think when it's modern day, there's just so much of that now that it's hard to make Batman stand out.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing where I feel it's not impossible, right? I mean, I think Matt Reeves showed pretty clearly, like, you can still do it. Like, that Gotham isn't some old age Gotham, right? I mean, I think Gotham from the Batman is modern day, but there's this temptation, I think, to, like, the more access you have to special effects, the harder it is to choose not to use them, or to choose to go, a clever route. To me, it's like the difference between the Jason Bourne movies and the James Bond movies, where Bond solves so many problems through technology that Q gave him, right? He's got some device that'll solve the problem. Whereas in the Bourne movies, Bourne has to come up with some clever way of using, like, a newspaper, or like ripping a map off the wall to know, where to go. And that's harder for the writer, right? It's like easier to just say, like, oh yeah, the protagonist has a thing that works, and now they can figure something out. The same way it's like, oh, they do some CSI thing, and of course there's some amount of research that goes into it. I don't want to denigrate the writing of various series like Bones or CSI or whatever. I think you can still have great writing with that. I just think there can be a temptation to just rely on your tech, to rely on your special effects, the same way you rarely get great fight choreography when you have big effects movies, right? When you have a big effects budget. Whereas, with action movies, especially made in Hong Kong and Thailand and places where the effects budget isn't so large, like, there's a level of creativity and innovation required in order to do something cool.
Right.
And of course you can combine those things, right? I mean, I think we saw in, like, Shang-Chi that you could take a big Hollywood movie and still have great, creative, interesting action in a practical sense. But that it's hard not to then just be like, oh, we're just going to rely on Batman's gadgets, on, some kind of, he's just got something in his utility belt to bail him out, as opposed to, like, no, let's make him think of something, really, really clever. Like, I think in Mad Love, which is a story we referenced in the bonus content, just $5 a month to become a member and listen to all of that. But, there's a thing where it's like, if I recall, Batman doesn't escape through some gadget. I think he escapes through some psychology, and the same goes in one of the episodes in Justice League, where he's dealing with Joker and Harley Quinn, and so I appreciate when the writers basically force themselves to be a little more clever, force themselves to be a little more creative, instead of being able to kind of rely on spy-fi type stuff, basically.
Like, I remember Robert Downey Jr. once making a comment about how he thought he had it best out of all the X-Men, because unlike most of the other actors, he never had to do any kind of fight training or choreography, because it was always going to be the CGI of the suit. And Like, don't get me wrong, I love the Iron Man movies, but they're doing something very fundamentally different. And
Yes.
I think that really works the technology here. I think another thing, and you and I have talked about this back and forth. I don't think we completely agree, but have some similar. I should not prejudge it. Another thing I think that's very dependent on the time it is set is that, and I think this goes for a lot of stories, but Batman especially. Batman was created at a time when there was there's always been some level of social awareness that the rich are screwing the poor. And because of that, some level of critique, or, the rich guys are all against us. But I think at that time, there was still the sense of like, well, but the rich people give back. They start the universities and the libraries and the arts, and they donate lots of things like that. And I, like, you might also say that on the flip side, that at this particular moment in time, we have a very high level of critique of billionaires and a very high level of eat the rich kind of sentiments, and the idea of like, oh, they're just doing that as the tax write-off and a cover up. And like, I've definitely heard it in the discourse that when I was first reading about Batman, the idea that a person who had all this money would then decide to use his money to help other people by becoming a crime fighter was like, yeah, that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And then in more recent years, people have started bringing up, well, okay, if he wants to fight crime, why doesn't he why doesn't he fund the social programs instead that help to prevent crime instead of beating up poor people? And like, there's all of this analysis of him through our current economic understanding, some of which I think is warranted, some of which I think is very overly simplistic. But like, for example, in both the Christopher Nolan and the Matt Reeves movie, I felt like they had to be a little bit more aware of, just because he's like, we have to go a little further than just saying he's a billionaire who's using his money to fight crime.
Mm.
And that even today, like, I know a lot of people who just had no interest in the Batman movie or the Batman character, because in their perspective, it's like, oh, I don't want to glorify a billionaire. Billionaires are all terrible. And again, that there's a whole economics argument there that I have a lot of sympathy for, but I think can be oversimplified. But it feels to me like that by putting it in a time period that's more like this, you avoid a lot of that. That kind of Batman, here's maybe the best way to say it, like TLDR, but like, Batman was written at a time when we have a very different understanding of the super wealthy than we do today. And that if you're going to take him out of those time periods, you have to have some level of accounting for that, or else it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think, so I'm not convinced that that's as true as you think it is in terms of what the overall kind of public opinion was around when Batman was created. I know sometime in the decade or decades before that, there was a heavy amount of resentment towards, the wealthy, like, especially, it's like coming out of the Depression and everything. Right. And there's, the term robber barons is not a new term. Right. But I can't speak to that too much. And so I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that doesn't match quite my understanding of how people were thinking at different points in time, but also I wasn't there. So,
just to add a little context, that from the
sure.
little historical study I've done of it, my understanding is like among the working class, among the poor, that would often be the thought.
Right.
But there was such an effort of, oh, that's just communist thinking to write it all. Certainly that by the 50s, like, there's none of that, that's allowed in public discourse.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is I feel like from the 50s through especially like the 80s, which were like the height of the greed is good idea, right? And then maybe with this being a little less true in like the 60s, like the late 60s, early 70s, right, where there was more, the stronger counterculture. I think, that was more true in that time rather than like really early, like 1939, right, or 8, right, when Batman was created. But I do think like there is something about when you're telling a story that takes place now, it's, even if it's this Gotham that doesn't exist in our world, right, where it's a different timeline from the one we live in. It's a fictional universe, even if there is a New York and Washington, D.C. and these, places that we have. I do think it makes it harder to ignore what you're talking about. Whereas here, when you do put something in a in sort of a film noir setting, I think it does give you more leeway, especially when you kind of say, okay, this is a film noir setting, and we're going to talk about things that we might want to talk about now, and that people may have been talking about then as well, but also we're not going to act like the social mores of the time were what they are here in our world, that were in our fictional world, right? Like we discussed with race and gender and sexuality, and that there's certainly some patronizing misogyny, but like not it doesn't feel like the same kind that you'd expect like in a show that was just like straight up set in the 40s, right, or 30s or whatever. So I think by doing that, by setting that all up that way, they kind of gave themselves like we can kind of just tell the story we want to tell without necessarily having to address this thing that is being addressed one way or another in the live action films. And just to address the overall argument, I do have a lot of sympathy for it. I think it's super reductive, and I also have issues with people critiquing movies that they don't want to see, which there's movies that I don't want to see that I'm like, I don't think I'm going to like that. I feel like I don't want to watch that, but also, and I mean, this is, of course, I have literally gone on here, even our last episode that we recorded before Batman, and talked about a show that I didn't see, but not in terms of, I think that this show is bad because such a whatever. It's just like,
right.
I think when you don't watch something, you have to understand that you haven't watched it and you don't have the full story or context.
Yeah, I think that was, and it's kind of like what we're trying to do with a lot of these episodes, is that was, hey, this show raises this question, and I'm curious if I just summarize it for you, what you think of the question.
Right.
Because I do think sometimes we sort of can get, like, I like those deeper questions, and when people want to nitpick on the exact details of the show, in order to kind of say, well, that answers the question. So like, well, but it's asking us to ask this larger question. That's right. I think we can go. But
which going back to the origins of this podcast, like the idea of like Civil War, Avengers, not X-Men, by the way. There was just when you're talking about Tony, but
thank you.
But
I'm sure he does become an X-Men at some point. But yes, Avengers.
Yeah, sure, probably. I mean, except he's not a mutant. But maybe Robert Downey Jr. is in some of these other roles, but the basic question, like you really wanted to discuss the question of like whether there should be this oversight, right? And I was like, but in the exact story, it's like it doesn't actually make the same sense in the story. So I do think a lot of times it is like, I believe in being concrete and being like, this is how this issue plays out in this context, and being very specific about that, because I don't think that super broad guidelines or ideas are that useful. I think they can be a useful starting place as long as we maintain the flexibility to be like, oh wait, that ghost is real. Now let me adjust my worldview and take this new information into account when I'm making decisions.
Yeah, certainly in that case, like when I say I'm Team Tony, I mean that the Captain America idea of I know best, and so only I should be able to decide how I use my power to enforce my idea of justice, that terrifies me. And so when Tony says we need some kind of oversight, I'm like, yes, you're exactly right. When he then says that Ross has come up with this perfect kind of oversight, I'm like, no, that's terrible. But like,
not that guy. That guy needs his own oversight.
And we're kind of on a tangent, but this is actually, I think, really, this is kind of like we're talking about how we talk about things in a way that I think is really relevant to stuff. I think that there is, like, I love the way you talk about this, because I often think there'll be kind of an intellectual dishonesty of someone proposes a general idea, and then someone points to one specific very bad application of the idea and says, therefore, the idea is bad.
Yeah.
or the reverse and says, hey, look, it worked in this one specific case, and I think
Yeah.
that's yeah, and it's why I think I like the fact that, and we talked about this last episode, that there are so many Batmans, because
Mm-hmm.
the flip side is we really only have one Luke Skywalker, kind of two if you take in the Legends, or the Legends might make it up to like 4 or 5 or 6.
Right. We have one
Um,
on screen, right?
Right. Yeah, there's only
Yeah.
one kind of official, whereas like
Yeah.
there's no battle about, Christopher Nolan's is part of a canon, and Matt
Mhm.
Reeves's is part of a canon, and Batfleck by Zack Snyder is
Yeah.
just as much a part of a canon, and that we get to kind of pick and choose, as we said, to be like, yeah, I don't think people are wrong or bad for liking Ben Affleck's version. It does not speak to what I like about the character of Batman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so having that, I think there are Batman stories where you might look at it and go like, oh, this seems like a very Bat dollars, right?
Yeah.
And then there's other ones we might look at and be like, well, he actually is spending most of his money, or trying to spend a lot of his money on social programs,
Right.
like that's not a thing. And you can say like, well, there shouldn't be any billionaires, like every billionaire's apologies failure, fine. But like, he's not necessarily going to single-handedly change the tax code. Like, do you want Batman to be a politician? Like, should
Right.
Bruce Wayne run for office? Like maybe he could get elected and like then actually enact sweeping social change. Although you might not like the sweeping social change that specifically this one guy would want to do. Who knows?
I tend to think that billionaires running for office has not been a very good thing in the United States.
Exactly. Like, I'd pick him over Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
But like, that doesn't, even though Bloomberg was not as bad as the other guy, like I was still like, how about not him? How about not either of them? So.
No, I think it's very true. So let's shift to another thing. The Arthur Dent of it all. The Harvey Dent. I keep saying Arthur Dent. I'm very sorry. Which you phrased in our notes as the other side of the Harvey Dent coin.
Yeah.
Because as we said, and this is a very different version of the Harvey Dent story than we've often gotten. And in fairness, we haven't gotten it that much. It just feels like that to me, I think, because it is probably the part of the Dark Knight story, the triangle between Dent and Batman and Gordon, that I'm most fascinated by. But tell us a bit about this version of Dent and how it feels different to you than other versions we've gotten.
Right. So, speaking of running for office, we meet this Dent in court as a district attorney, trying a case against Barbara Gordon's defendant, right? She's representing a defendant. She's a public defender, I believe. And he's running for mayor. After court is adjourned, he like tries to give her a campaign button. She's like, oh, why don't you save this for someone who might actually vote for you?
Yeah.
And so, he's this very kind of smarmy, maneuvering, maybe wants to try and do some like good with the law, and doesn't want to be corrupted by, is it Thorne? I'm trying to remember. Yeah. Right. And then ultimately does become corrupted by Thorne.
And just to give background, Thorne is there's almost always a mob element in the Batman story that has its hooks into the police, and that's Thorne, and what Thorne is able to help Harvey Dent get elected if he will be willing to look the other way when some of Thorne's men come up for possible prosecution.
Right. He basically stands in for Falcone because they're like, let's not use Falcone every time.
Yeah.
Right. So he basically agrees to, work with him and essentially sell a part of his loyalty or whatever in order to get elected, or in order to have a better chance of getting elected, because he's losing in the polls. And right at the end of it, when he has to do a thing that he thinks is not a good thing, he decides, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to, betray the mobster who I made a deal with, and try and do what I think is justice. And then he ends up getting acid thrown in his face in the bathroom, which again, like, lack of technology allows this to be a plot line, right?
Yeah.
Like this, how's this going to happen in a modern day courthouse with tons of cameras and metal detectors and all these things? It's just not here. But here it plays. It's like, yeah, this could happen. So this is how he sort of becomes Two-Face, where, you know, in a literal sense, right? Because half of his face is kind of burnt off with acid. And he withdraws his campaign, although I feel like he probably should have just kept running and maybe he'd have a pretty good chance, because he'd be like, I've been literally attacked by the mob. I'm a hero for standing up to them. Vote for me. You know,
although the Jedi have left me scarred, I will. I mean, he's not that, but yeah, that's immediately what I thought of. Is
right.
Palpatine, but
yeah,
go on.
Exactly. So like, I think he, you know, he definitely had a shot, but he clearly it hurt him, right? Like on an emotional level, on a psychological level, and he doesn't believe in himself the same way. He doesn't love himself in the same way. Like, he's a very narcissistic, like, good-looking guy, and then he has half his face burned off, and that, I think, challenges his sense of identity. And one of the interesting,
I would say, to go deeper on that, I think he, like a lot of folks who are narcissistic or have other kind of things like that. Let me back up a second. And I think another part of this is that, like a lot of folks who are, sort of very focused on outside affirmation for others, part of the idea is that when this happens to him, in part maybe because he's been physically scarred, in part because people are like, oh, even if the mob can even get to him, like, I don't want to be too close to him. Like, he's kind of abandoned by a lot of people. And I think that's another part of it, is what feeds into his sense of, like, who am I if all these people aren't, like, loving me and supporting me?
Yeah, exactly. So he's abandoned by most people, but he also recedes from the world, right? Like, those things are both true. And Bruce Wayne reaches out to him in, I think, a well-intentioned but poorly thought through fashion.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things I think is one of the more interesting parts of the story, is that Bruce is like, oh, come on, Harvey, let's just go out. Let's go out on the town. This will make everything better. We'll act like nothing's wrong, and you'll just be your old self, kind of. And I think Bruce doesn't really accept or understand what Harvey's going through. And just, like, being there for him and being like, hey, we could sit at home and watch TV, even though maybe it hasn't been invented yet. Although I think it has. Are there televisions? I'm trying to remember. I
mean, they can sit around and listen to the radio, whatever it is.
Yeah, we can sit around, listen to the radio. We can just talk and whatever, play cards, which seems like that would probably be a better approach, or be like, hey, I'm here for you. If you want to hang out, cool. If you don't, I'll give you some space, but I'll be here. I'll be around.
Yeah, like, everyone has probably either known, or in my case, I've been both, but, like, that friend who sees that you're upset, they have their idea of what they think you need, and then becomes utterly unwilling to listen to what you actually say you need.
Right, exactly.
It's very much that, like, yeah, you just need to go out. You need to go out. And good.
Oh, I do think it's very easy to be critical of the person who thinks they know what you need, and I think they're wrong in that regard. And I think it is important to give space, but also let someone know you're there for them, and make suggestions without being overly pushy. But at the same time, I think it's very hard. And I think one of the hardest things is to be trying to help someone, or wanting to help someone, whether you're trying or not, but just being like, that's your desire, is to help someone, and just, like, having no idea what's actually going to help, or even having nothing that will help.
And kind of like I really have a lot of sympathy for both the people in this situation. And here's where also I think, like, impact, not intention, really matters. But, like, I think that the idea of you always need to let a person tell you what they need is very, very valid. I also think that sometimes when people are in a really bad place mentally or with other things, they're not the best judge of what they may need, or they're telling themselves, oh, I don't want to be a bother to you, or stuff like that. So, and to me, the reason why all this matters, I think, and it's funny, I hadn't thought about this until I rewatched the show again over the weekend, and then also in talking with you just now. And I want to talk about what it means for Harvey Dent, to be sure, but I also think this is very illustrative of who Bruce Wayne is, and how much this is still a year one kind of a story, in terms of this is Batman still figuring out who he's going to be. Because I think in a lot of portrayals, especially the Christopher Nolan, and even to some extent, and also the Tim Burton and a lot of the others like that, everything that Bruce Wayne does, Bruce Wayne is a very well thought out, meticulously planned character that Batman is playing. And then every time he has a social faux pas, it's very strategic as a
Mm.
way of sort of like, this is why people shouldn't be so interested in me, or this is why
Right.
people should leave me alone, or this is why everyone should leave my building so I can have a fight with Ra's al Ghul, who might burn it down, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I get none of that from this Bruce Wayne. I get that he is still trying to figure out, I can help people when I wear the mask, but also can I just be a good friend and help people as Bruce Wayne?
Yeah.
And I could see his sort of confusion about why didn't this work, as well as like a guy who was raised by his butler in a fairly isolated setting, having a fairly bad idea of how other people work and what's going to help them.
Yeah.
Like it all just speaks to me of like, yeah, this is exactly what a Bruce Wayne would do. And I can imagine a Bruce Wayne thinking about this conversation and going, to hell with it. I'm just going to make Bruce Wayne be a stoic, pulled back person, and I'll help people by beating up the bad guys.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it in exactly that way, but the idea that like maybe Bruce Wayne can help, and then trying to do that and having it go so badly, like just totally backfiring. I can certainly see being like, all right, I'm just going to be Batman. Enough of Bruce Wayne. I'll just put on the Bruce Wayne mask when I have to go to a fundraiser and like, act in a way that like people don't want to be around me that much. Or they do, but like kind of from a distance, right? And I think that's a really good point. It makes sense.
So let's now get back to the Harvey Dent of it all. So we wind up with a Harvey Dent who I think is like, he is literally two-faced in terms of the two different sides of his face. And he's now aware of what he perceives as the hypocrisy of all the people around him.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the other, I feel like if this is his I feel like at the end of this season, the creation myth of Two-Face is not finished. And he might have died at the end. Comic book rules, we haven't really seen a body, so who knows?
Yeah. We have seen a ghost, so
we have seen a ghost. So
we know that death isn't death.
But like, because to me, he never becomes he never flips a coin. We see him as he is as just Harvey Dent flipping the two-sided coin that's heads on both sides, but never I'm going to decide who lives or dies, or I'm going to live everything according to chance, or everything has to be like these two different. He's not as focused on dualities as the character often becomes.
Right. Yeah. He's not he never becomes a fully realized Two-Face in this. And he does become homicidal, right? Mm-hmm. He does decide he's just gonna, he's focused on vengeance, and it's interesting because like I feel like this season really the main story, you can say it was Harvey Dent, but I think it was Harvey Dent and Barbara Gordon. And
that's fair.
I think the two of them having this like very significant but non-romantic relationship, I think is very interesting. I enjoyed it throughout the season. And, he's basically he's her antagonist in the beginning, right?
Right.
Like
because she's a public defender.
She's a public defender. Exactly. And then he's just like, oh, I'm just doomed or whatever. And then she's like trying to save him at the end. Right.
Right.
But then as Flass is trying to shoot her, he saves her. And, like by getting in the way of the bullet and getting all dead. But like, it just feels like an interesting kind of like turnaround from this, compared to the Dark Knight. And this is why I described it as like the other side of the coin of the Dark Knight, where he is where a woman is killed, and in a way deliberately to try to make him lose it, essentially, right? Like
and it's done by Joker, and very much the kind of like everyone. This is Harvey Dent's one bad day. Exactly.
And the Joker is trying to create that. And so so that's this like Joker kind of, and that's basically what he's doing the Killing Joke thing, right? Of trying to be like, I'm going to give this person this one bad day just to prove that anyone can snap like I did, essentially, right? And in the Killing Joke, famously, Joker shoots Barbara, in order to try to, so like he basically tries to fridge Barbara in order to have this effect on Gordon, on Jim Gordon, on Commissioner Gordon.
Right.
And, you know, in a much, I think, maligned decision, because then the actual quotes from the people involved are awful. And, you know, from like how that came about. But so here, having their two stories intertwined in a way that's like, this is his one bad day, except it kind of really is his one good day, where like he made a decision to like do the right thing, and then that backfired on him horribly. And then again, when it came down to it, he decided he was going to do what he thought was like the right thing in a way that was, you know, fatal for him. But
for others.
And for but I mean at the very end.
Oh yeah.
But yes, before that, I don't think his vengeance was trying to do the right thing necessarily.
Okay,
I thought you were saying it was. Now I understand.
No, I'm talking about just jumping in the way of the bullet, right? But so I feel like this is a Harvey who basically had something bad happen to him and then sought vengeance, but then at the end sacrificed himself in a way that I feel is like the opposite of the Dark Knight Harvey, who dies a hero despite having become a villain. Here, he still kind of dies a villain, right? Like, I don't know whether his name gets cleared or anything of all this stuff while dying a hero. So it's like, it kind of, it like flips the story in a way that, you know, while watching it, I feel like I'm aware of that, but it doesn't feel like they're like winking at you and like trying to make that point really hard. I just feel like it's kind of a nice story that's a compliment, because like the idea of, you know, Two-Face, I think is, and Harvey Dent and Two-Face is that like he is, that's like, it's not necessarily just that. I mean, sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, but like, this definitely, he doesn't become the kind of like crime boss Two-Face or whatever. And, you know, you could say that in the Dark Knight, he becomes a version of Two-Face, but he's not fully realized Two-Face. He doesn't really make it that far.
Right. I mean, the Nolan movies in general avoid the sort of comic book levels of like, you know, he doesn't have like the two henchwomen dressed all in black and all in white. And
exactly. Exactly.
You know, I think those are all really good points. And I think it's, in one regard, I'll say, I think part of it comes down to, again, the time in which these stories are set, because I think in the Christopher Nolan movies, one of the things that all three of them, and then Batman and Gordon, once they realize Dent is dead, are very concerned about is the public image of all of this and how it's going to play. And I think that, you know, obviously the press is still a feature in, like, you know, the 1920s and even, you know, far before that. But it is also, it's much easier to cover things up, you know, than it is by the time of the Nolan movies. And so to some extent that's taken off the plate. I also think it's like, I feel Matt Reeves in general is one of the most hopeful images of Batman. But this also feels like one of the most hopeless. And I think it's a very interesting way to set up the coming seasons that I hope we're going to get, because, you know, and this is especially in the Nolan movies, but also in a lot of the comics and some of the other portrayals, part of what Batman's goal is always is, you know, not just to strike fear into the heart of the criminals, but it's that, like, you know, we shouldn't be afraid, they should be afraid. And so every time, like, you want the criminal to be afraid, but you also want the people to be able to, like, no, I'm not going to let Falcone boss me around. I am going to do the right thing as a judge or just a clerk at the office, or a beat cop, or a prosecuting attorney. And here, it doesn't work. Harvey Dent does that exact thing. He's like, no, I'm not going to let myself be bossed around either out of fear or out of my own personal ambition. I'm going to stand up. And then he has the acid thrown in his face. And you're right. He's not treated like a hero. He's not like welcomed back. You know, he's kind of put aside. And as a person with a disability who remembers all the folks saying like it's not going to change anything in how you're perceived, I definitely think that, like, my own understanding of how much of a freak and a weirdo I would be seen as because I was an amputee was way overblown. But also all the people who blew sunshine up my ass telling me that everything was going to be just fine exactly it was also kind of overblown. And and that's something that's shown where part of Bruce Wayne is saying, like, who's going to stare at you? Everyone loves you. And they go to a restaurant. It's pretty clear people are staring at him. I don't know, uncomfortable around him. And also some of it that it's a lot in his head as well. I mean, it's this complicated mix. But
it's hard to tell. Yeah.
The point of all this is it feels like it's a very interesting version of that story of saying, like, Harvey did try to stand up, but couldn't protect himself in a way that Batman could. And it cost him everything.
Yeah.
And his mental reaction to it is part of what cost him everything. But like, it definitely, the acid throwing in his face, I think, leads to a fairly direct path. It leads to his maybe death, maybe who knows. So yeah, it was just one more way in which I think at first I didn't like it. And at first I was just like, I don't want, in part because I found like the Harley and Quinzel story and some of the others so interesting. I just didn't want 3 full episodes about Dent.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I think about it, the more I think like, okay, it wasn't like they were not my 3 most enjoyable episodes of the show by any means, but I do think that they made some really interesting points that I'm enjoying thinking about now.
Yeah. And I would say I hear you for sure. I also think there's been a little more Dent than, like, not in the live action so much. I mean, there was a little in like in the original Batman, right? I mean,
yeah. No, but you're right. We get him becoming Two-Face a lot in like some of the animated stories, and
right. But also, I mean, Two-Face as one of the main villains, right, in the animated series, but also in the Long Halloween. I think we get him there. So or whether it's Two-Face or not, we get a fair amount of Harvey Dent. But yeah, here I'd say it wasn't so much that I was like, oh, good, another Harvey Dent story. It was more that it was like I enjoyed Barbara's role in this one. I enjoyed how, seeing Bruce try to handle it and then not doing well with that. And, so I think a lot of other characters also, and the way that they interacted with that story, I think made it more interesting than if it was like just exactly the same story,
Yeah, I think it's very true. I think you're very right about that. And it is there's an extent to which I never actually put this together before, but like, I think you could look at Bruce Wayne Batman as a Two-Face character. Like, I think a lot of others would see that as similar. And I think that like, it's not that I think Harvey Dent is essential to like the formation of Batman, but I think it's a very good point, pivotal point. And as we said before in last episode on this, it meant that they were able to keep Joker completely off stage for the entire season. And I do really appreciate that, and curious to see where it'll go.
Yeah, I mean, Joker and Riddler, and then Penguin was really just episode 1, so a lot of the villains that have gotten a lot of screen time had a lot less screen time. And I appreciate that, especially for like a first season.
And we do get, Gentleman Ghost and Firebug and things like that, which there's a lot else we want to cover, and we're already going pretty long, but just 5 minutes maximum. What did you think of what is normally Batman? I think of as one of the most grounded characters. He's fighting other human beings who have powers and abilities that would make sense in our world, with some exceptions. And even then, they're scientifically explained. Having just the straight up supernatural appear in the middle of the season.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, and I forget the other character's name, but the vampire girl, which, by the way, Matt Reeves directed the American version of Let the Right One In. I think it's called Let Me In, which is about a little vampire girl. And then here, he's one of the executive producers, and there's this little girl who's a vampire,
Interesting. That's fun, because I thought of it as kind of a reference to Ace from the Royal Flush Gang in Batman the original series.
Both of those for sure.
Yeah.
I thought that, especially, I mean, with Batman carrying her out, under his cape after when the sun comes up, right? I mean, that was like almost like a direct parallel to the end, the thing with Ace. And actually, I thought that storyline was really beautiful part of it, and it had like a bunch of Robins in it, and I just thought was interesting and different, and even if it was like these other things as well, but having, I think it is a kind of modern misconception that like Batman exists in this world of just like normal people without superpowers, and they're all just punching each other and they have some technology and that's about it. Like from the comics, from I don't know how early on, but like there have been supernatural elements for a long, long time. There's like Gotham overrun by zombies or vampires, or there are supernatural things going on in Gotham all the time, not in the more recent movies. And I guess the Tim Burton and then Joel Schumacher movies don't have a lot of like real, they have like science fiction, right?
Yeah.
Like in the way that like Spider-Man has science fiction, where there's science is doing stuff that science don't do, right? Like
there's no aliens, there's no other dimensions or, supernatural or magic or things like that.
Right. But in and then in the Christopher Nolan one is like super grounded, and then the Matt Reeves is like, I'll show you grounded, right? like they've just been like one upping each other in that regard and being like, this is just a normal world Batman. But I mean, the Ben Affleck Batman, literally, it's him versus an alien in his first appearance, right? And in the first Justice League animated series, I mean, obviously, you've got 3 aliens, I think, on the crew, and like a goddess who is basically made out of clay, and then like someone with superpowers and someone with a magic item, right? And then he's like the normal dude. But so I think Batman has had supernatural stuff that he's interacted with for a long, long time in the comics, for a long time in animation, but very rarely on screen in live action. And so I think that's where this conception of, I think the idea of like him not having superpowers but contending with those with superpowers is actually, it kind of ups the ante, right? On the like, no, it's just going to be like street level, like nobody has any powers. And it's like, well, actually they have powers, but he doesn't. I mean, he's got money and toys and stuff, but and sometimes a magic item.
One of the few things that I think Zack Snyder got exactly right about Batman is when he is in a world with Superman and Cyclops and Wonder Woman and all the rest, and someone asks, what's your power? And he says, I'm rich. Because like, the money of his level, like there are things that he can do that no one of those other characters can do. But
I mean, I think, intelligence and, determination and whatever, but sure. Yes. I mean, it is essentially in our world, one of the real superpowers, basically just being obscenely wealthy, right?
Exactly. And I think I had a similar feeling. I was really set up for it to be that he's going to show that this doesn't actually exist,
right?
And at first I was catching things and being like, come on, writers, like if the whole point is that it isn't really a ghost, like you're really pressing credulity here. And then I was like, oh no, you're actually doing that. Okay,
it is a ghost.
Didn't call that. Fair enough. And I liked it. It was a fun sort of story about like, fighting old ideas of racism and all that kind of stuff, and classism, which I think is kind of one thing that helped me is that I feel like one of the points of his wealth that you could see very easily is the way that he calls Alfred Pennyworth. Because it really comes off as like, you are my servant, so I don't see you as fully human. When it's done with the rich and they're the people who work for them. I think it's very clear in the story that that's not why he does it. It's because of the particular, like, Alfred is kind of becoming another parental figure to him, and he just lost his parental figures and is no interested in like making himself vulnerable to that kind of loss again. So he keeps him at a distance by calling him Pennyworth. But
but he also realizes over time that it kind of looks like the other thing. And certainly feels like the other thing, right? To Alfred, perhaps. And so that does actually seem like the largest character growth for for Batman and Bruce Wayne.
And just kind of one part of that connects to the next topic I want to bring up is that I think part of what threw me is that, as you said, some Batmans have a lot of supernatural, some don't. Batman in the Justice League obviously has a ton of it. And that Batman is an outgrowth of Batman the Animated Series. It even has the same voice actor, Kevin Conroy. Batman the Animated Series, though, to me felt much more grounded. Like, I think the supernatural does exist in a couple of episodes, but not until later seasons for the most part, and it's still very, very rare.
Yeah.
Every now and then Superman wants him to go off and fight Darkseid together. Like, that's in there.
Yeah, and there's the Lazarus Pit, right? I mean,
Right, exactly, with Ra's al Ghul and stuff like that. But yeah, it just I think because the aesthetic is so much Batman the Animated Series, it threw me a lot.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of the point, is also kind of be like, no, this isn't. We're obviously paying homage to a number of different Batmans, and we're paying homage to the original animated show and a lot of our aesthetic, but that's not what the show is.
Right. Yeah, and I think the idea of there being something supernatural as a bit of a plot twist only works if the audience doesn't know that that's the plot twist, right? Like, there are if you made a preview for Signs that showed the aliens, like it would be like oh, that doesn't okay, I guess there's no surprise there, right? Or you explained the Sixth Sense or various things, and so I think Batman having supernatural antagonists and perhaps allies is not something that should be completely surprising. But because there have been so many stories told without that, it sets you up for that actually being a surprise. And I as well. I mean, I know the character. I've seen Gentleman Ghost before, but I kind of half expected, oh, well, they're not actually going to do this as a supernatural thing. And then it was like, oh, they are. I wasn't sure until he came through the thing that it it was that they were going that direction, even knowing the character in the first place, because they could go another way with it. They could have it be a hoax, right? I mean, they changed a lot of characters, so there's no reason they couldn't take a ghost and be like, yeah, that's not actually a real ghost. That's a hoax, and the thing that I'm not sure whether we mentioned it in the first episode or in the bonus content, but I do think I just want to double down on the whole, I don't believe in the supernatural. I think once the supernatural's real, it's not even supernatural, it's just natural then. But there's a lot of things that a lot of people believe in that I don't believe in because of a lack of evidence. But I do think it's very important to acknowledge, once there's evidence, once there's compelling evidence, then whatever your beliefs are, you should change them. That's the thing. It's what evidence is there? Okay, I don't find that convincing. Fine. But then at a certain point, it's oh no, that ghost is real, especially in that world where there's no technology that's going to be able to create a hologram the way maybe you could now,
Yeah, probably. But yeah, no, I think it's very true. And I think we talked about this a bit last episode, but it's worth kind of underlining. To me, that is the greatest sign of Batman's intelligence, because I think, and we see this in the world all around us, and this is on everything from refusing to believe that one strategy to play a video game might actually be better, or refusing to believe that something that changes your political beliefs in a fundamental way, or that you think that these kind of people are bad or evil, and you see direct evidence of it. It's very easy for us to build a worldview so rigid that when new evidence comes up to us, we just find ways to explain it away, or to we talked about this in the Planet of the Apes movie episode I just did with Riki, that's a lot about how on both sides, humans and apes will both be like, no, that evidence doesn't fit my worldview, so the evidence must be destroyed.
Right.
And Batman's willing to be like, no, okay, this is new information. I can objectively say, no matter what. Because I don't know if this is a comic someone told me about or an episode I saw, but I remember there being one episode where a fairly young Bruce Wayne, maybe it came up in Gotham, I'm not sure, but someone is trying to tell him that ghosts are real, and part of why he is no, I don't believe that, is because then he might want to find the ghost of his parents or something like that.
Interesting.
Part of his sort of healing is they are dead, they are gone, I can remember them, but so. Right. Anyway, listeners, if you remember where I got that from, please write in and let me know so I can not feel like I'm losing my mind over this. Let's talk about the last kind of thing we wanted to touch on, the voice actors.
Yeah.
In this, because I think they're really high quality.
I agree. The Batman is played by Hamish Linklater, not certain pronunciation. I believe it's of Scottish origin, but who does, I think, a fantastic Kevin Conroy without sounding like he's trying to do an impersonation.
Yeah.
Like, I really felt like this is my Batman, you know, like this is the Bruce Wayne sounded like Bruce Wayne. Batman sounded like someone different, but the same, you know, and had that not overdone gravelly, but, you know, kind of deep and commanding and confident. And I just think he did a great job. You know, I think really across the board, I really enjoyed the voice acting. You were talking about Harleen Quinzel, who's played by Jamie Chung, who's been in a number of, she's in like Batman Soul of the Dragon and a number of other animated things. And it's funny because like I didn't even like really notice that like Harleen Quinzel was Asian, but like I think some of that's animation, right? Where I mean, we've talked about this with Batman Beyond, where it's like Terry McGinnis looks Asian. He looks like half Asian at least, right? Yeah. And there is a certain, you know, race in animation can be more ambiguous than it is in live action or in person or whatever. Even though the whole thing is there is a level of ambiguity in some cases when, you know, the whole long thing there. But like,
I think I said in last episode, like my first thought was that she was Asian, but then my overall, what I thought was like, she's a person of color. I think she's Asian, but if you told me she's Puerto Rican or like Latina in some way, I would not be shocked, you know?
Right. Yeah. Which generally then I land on like Filipina, you know, but like, but yeah, I appreciate that in terms of, you know, in terms of the animation, but I also loved her Harleen and Harley, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's a great character, and it was, and she was really well voiced, and really just across the board, you know. They have Christina Ricci as Catwoman. I'm trying to remember who I thought she was. I heard Catwoman and I was like, oh, who is this? And I thought it was someone specific. Oh, I thought it was the voice actress for Azula at first.
Oh, interesting.
This Catwoman, Selena Kyle, really channels her like inner Azula. I feel like she's got a very similar vibe, which just really worked for me. But it wasn't. It was Christina Ricci. And we mentioned before Minnie Driver as Oswalda Cobblepot. And yeah, and just you know, could go on, but like,
yeah, like I'm not sure
if you want.
I didn't love the Harvey Dent like episodes, but I thought the actor playing him was fantastic, and I never had a moment where I thought like this doesn't feel real, you know?
Right? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I feel like DC tends to really get voice acting. I didn't see who the directors or the voice casting was. Andrea Romano did so many of those ones before, but I don't remember seeing her name. But yeah. Anyway, it just I feel like it's Agnes Kim and Sarah Noonan who did the casting.
Nice.
So, but yeah, I just think you know, they really got excellent voice acting. I saw, I think it was Bruce Timm talking about how Warner Brothers approached him to like do a continuation of Batman the Animated Series, and he was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. Like maybe some of it's because Kevin Conroy died, and it just, I don't think it would feel right, you know, to be like, let's get someone to literally impersonate Kevin Conroy, which, you know, has been done, of course, in various series, but not Kevin Conroy, but other voice actors. But also just, it's like, sometimes I think it's like, you know what, like, how many episodes did they do? Like, do you really want to pick up where you left off and like add to that exact story? Or do you want to do something fresh, you know?
Yeah.
And so he had a bunch of...
You do Batman the Animated Series, like, in some ways you could call this a prequel, and then you have all the prequel problems that you get into.
Right.
Or you could say it's a continuation, then like, how many
You-
stories are off the board because you've
Yeah,
already done them.
You can't what you did do what you did with Harley, right? You can't do what you did with Penguin. Like you can't do what you did with Harvey. You know, you really, they went through a lot of characters and they told a lot of stories, and apparently there were a bunch of ideas that they wanted to do, but we're like, well, that doesn't really fit this audience, right? Because I don't know if it was like Saturday afternoon cartoon or morning or whatever, but it's like, you know, it's for a particular demographic it was aimed at. And I think this one is aimed at, you know, older and or wider demographic. And, you know, some of the things are like, you know, oh, well, characters are clearly dying and this is like more mature or whatever, which I generally think is like a load.
BTAS was very mature and a lot of people died.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, there's an extent to which like the Batman story is about death, right? That's like his primary motivation. The trauma of two people dying right in front of his eyes. Like, and I think a lot of the stories that are like, we're going to kill a bunch of characters and that's going to be mature. And I'm like, yeah, are you actually like really dealing with death in a mature way? Or are you just kind of like, look, we killed some people.
Yeah. Look, we got an R rating because we're so edgy.
Right. Exactly. But like here, I do feel like, you know, they did not like, we're going to try and tell an adult story, but just like, hey, these are some ideas for stories we had. We're going to tell them the way we want because we now have license to, you know, it's on a streaming platform. You know, we don't have to, we're not reined in quite the same way we were before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the budget of an animated show is so much smaller than the budget of a live action movie, if nothing else, because, you know, think about the actors we just talked about, none of whom are like huge Hollywood A-listers, but are still, you know, well-known people in Hollywood who I'm sure get paid well.
Yeah.
You can ask them to commit themselves to 6 months of a movie shoot, or maybe a total of like 5 2-hour recording sessions, you know, over a few months. Like, it's just a very different level of what you can do.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes even somebody can just record the audio in their home, right? I mean, I don't know how they did this series, but that's like a thing now. That's how they did the Last Dragon, right?
What the hell was that movie? Is it Kaya and the Dragon?
Raya the Last Dragon.
Right? Raya the Last Dragon. Yeah, I mean that most of the voice acting was done exactly that way because it was done during pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with you all that. I think, like, at first it felt to me like it was going to be a continuation of BTAS, and I'm glad it wasn't that, but it felt like it was saying, yes, there are all of these different Batmans out there. We're going to have a new take on Batman, but we're starting from BTAS and the comics that comes from.
Yeah.
Like, we're not
like that essence.
Yeah. And that there's like, it's not like an FU to people who like Schumacher or who like Batfleck, but it's also like, if you didn't love those, don't worry. We got you.
We got you. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And unrelated to this, but I want to add like one cool thing. And this was some feedback we actually got. Person asked not for their name to be mentioned, but just we chatted online of it, and he said that for him growing up, he grew up with Batman 66, the rock'em sock'em, you know, pow, all bright colors kind of thing. And that's his Batman. And then he totally understands that. But that's why for him, the Schumacher movies are the closest thing that he has seen to that, because they're campy very much in the way that the show was. And that for him, you know, as a young person growing up, that's what he loved. And so, you know, just another reminder that like something can be totally not my Batman, but it's someone else's, because like we talk about how dark and gritty Batman is. Batman 66 was most people's only live action Batman for a long time.
Yeah.
And it is not gritty. And it is not
it's
dark.
Not. And that was the first one I saw too. I mean, I watched that as a kid. I enjoyed it as a kid. I loved it as a kid. And actually, I feel like in this series, you get Onomatopoeia, who's the leader of the assassins, right? And I feel like kind of ticks that box in a kind of gentle way. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And like I still think Eartha Kitt may be the best Catwoman.
Like, yes. Well, she's the only one that ever meowed at me. So
yes, very true. Very true. All right. Well, thank you all so much, Paul. Thank you. We're gonna have some bonus content, just talking a bit more about like how we kind of see other superheroes compared to Batman in these different settings that we're talking about. But for everyone who's not a member yet, please think about becoming one. $5 a month, $55 a year. You get bonus content at the end of every episode. You get full bonus episodes. And of course, you get to help support what we're doing here. It's really great. It helps keep the lights on. As I mentioned, this is probably going to be the last episode that goes live before we go on hiatus for a couple of weeks. just gives us a time to kind of like stop, readjust, get back on top of our schedule, as well as also think about how can we make even better content for you all. So especially if you have thoughts about what you would like to see more from these episodes, please let us know. Thank you so much for Paul. Ricky will be back soon. We have spoken. All right, welcome back. So, is there another character that you can think of that has had this many different versions of themselves as a Batman?
As a Batman? Oh, as Batman? Like
Yeah.
our characters had as many versions as Batman?
Yeah.
I mean, my first guess would be like Sherlock Holmes.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
You know,
Who I think there is some connection to two of them for sure.
Absolutely, and I think ties into the sort of time period as relevant but not essential, right? As in the Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman version. I love it's maybe my favorite Sherlock, and it's set in modern day. I haven't watched Elementary, which I think I would like to see someday. Which has Lucy Liu as Watson, I believe.
Yep.
I think, right? And then
that one's about like Sherlock as being much more broken. Then you have like the Robert Downey Jr.
Yes,
which is about gay camp of Sherlock Holmes, which is I haven't seen, but I know a lot of people love. You've got the more modern one, and then you've got a lot of other like you can House is 100% a Sherlock Holmes adaptation.
Inspired, right? I mean, you could say every Batman story, or at least the ones where he's a detective, are. I mean, wait, did you say something about this last time? Did someone say like about how Batman was actually very? Oh, they didn't reference Sherlock.
Yeah, because of copyright
issues
and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and I mean, like House, I think is a little more like House for Holmes, Wilson for Watson, like the King.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of very, very specific ways in which that TV show is very much this. This is more of an inspired rather than an adaptation. But,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think I think Sherlock might actually be the character who I think has had the most different actors portray him or something, at least in Western cinema. You know, I mean, I recently watched Judge Dee's Mystery on Netflix, which is very if I had to compare it to one thing, it would be the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlocks. But mixed with like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, you know.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, I mean it's worth a watch.
James Bond is probably close, and
James Bond, yeah.
James Bond, though, I'd say you have different versions, but that is most of the core elements stay the same. The one thing I think that changes is how the audience reacts to this kind of character. So that you have, when we're in the midst of the Cold War, this is very serious, and we love James Bond, and he's our hero, and as the Cold War starts to end, we get him more as like a buffoon, kind of the Timothy Dalton, like we're kind of laughing at his womanizing. And then we get to a point where we're like, yeah, people who just run around the world and kill lots of people and womanize and get people into danger, that's not cool. And we get kind of the Daniel Craig.
Yeah.
But the core elements stay the same. I would say another one that I think probably has a number of voice actors, but also I think has really changed over the years, although again, it's often with the changing times, is Superman. Because for one thing, the relationship of Superman to Lois has changed quite dramatically based on the current sort of gender mores of the time, and everything from her being, in some ways, it kind of come around full circle, that like in the 30s, it was still, she was, I think would be looked on today as like a feminist icon, kind of hard-bitten, a good detective. You've got a long period in the 50s and 60s when she's mostly just kind of like a nagging housewife.
Right.
All the way up to, we did an episode a couple of weeks ago with Riki and Jessica about a new series called My Adventures with Superman, that it modernizes his relationship with Lois and with Jimmy, and has all three of them as like people starting at the Daily Planet at the same time. But it's also one of the first, I think, like you talk about the change in our relationship to billionaires, the relationship to the media has changed incredibly dramatically. And this one is very much about first of all, all the like social media versions of the media, but also the just the lack of trust in the media compared to other times and stuff like that. And yeah, like, and I'm not a big Superman fan, but like I've heard Jessica often talk about like how different versions are or not her Superman for various reasons. And I'd say that like the Superman I've seen in like Smallville and in this New Adventures are much more Superman I care about than Christopher Reeve and ones like that.
Yeah, the Christopher Reeve Superman was definitely my favorite, and then the animated one also.
Mm-hmm.
Those are like my Superman. Like which isn't to say, I don't know, I have to like rewatch them and be like, oh wait, what happened?
Yeah.
You know, like I know there's something about like amnesia, like induced amnesia from kissing, which like I think I'm against that.
Yeah.
But like yeah, I also Christopher Reeve's the only Superman that I got to play volleyball with. So
that's fair.
It's these personal connections that really make things.
I only know that my dad sued him. So
right, yeah. My dad shot him on film.
Yeah, and like I loved him as a kid, to be sure. I think honestly, like the 1989 Tim Burton, I was like, Batman who? I mean, Superman who? Batman's a cool one now.
Right.
And I will say, I really liked in Justice League. I feel like the version of Superman that I like most is as a foil to Batman.
Oh yeah.
Because they have such, I think they're both hopeful, and I like that.
Yeah.
One is very sort of like, the world is going to be great, so let's just focus on the good and fight for the good. And Batman is like, everything is terrible and broken, but I think there's a little tiny light of hope and we can fight for it.
Right.
And I'm much more on that side, but I think having a Superman he gets to talk to all the time helps to bring out it in both of them.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely the dynamic between the two of them, which I think by far the best I've seen of is, I mean, it starts in World's Finest in the Superman the Animated Series, right, where they like meet for the first time, and I think it's a really cool set of episodes. And then there's another one where Superman plays Batman, so that's another actor who played Batman within the context of the show. Superman played Batman.
Oh, I love that.
It's hilarious. It's amazing. Because Bruce Wayne's like missing, and it's like Gotham needs Batman, so like Superman puts on the bat suit. It's like, it's amazing. But like I think those then played into the Justice League series, where I do, it all kind of comes to a head when like, the whole Cadmus arc, and I mean, won't get too deep into it, but just like Superman being this like hopeful Boy Scoutish whatever, and then and then at some point Batman refers to someone else as the Boy Scout, and Superman's like, I thought I was the Boy Scout, and Batman's like, so did I. But like, not anymore. And so, I think the interaction between those two characters when they're I want to say done right, but I don't want to say it that way. But like when they're done in a way that I like, that both of those characters feel like the versions of them that I most recognize and appreciate.
Right. And often with Diana being kind of in the middle and not as a moderator, but it's kind of like sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been great, Paul. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. As our listeners, our members, thank you. You're what makes all this possible. Please send in your feedback. Let us know what you thought. We have spoken.
It's probably like Shakespeare, though, right? Most adapted character, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Richard Reed is that the name of Mr. Fantastic?
Yeah. Yes. No. It doesn't sound right. It is Reed Richards.
Reed Richards. Okay.
I was like, it sounds so right, but so wrong.
Right? I was like, Richard Reed. No,
so
Reed.
Close.
He's probably had a number, just because you've had the 2 Fantastic Four movies, a number of voice actors. He's showed up in a couple of other like multiverse things.
For sure.
Yep. All right.
Cool.
We out.